In June 1943, a train pulled into a dusty station in Pickens County, Alabama. The small farming town of Aliceville, population 1,500, had never seen anything like what stepped off those cars. Hundreds of sunburned young men in khaki uniforms poured onto the platform. They wore large-billed cloth caps and goggles pushed up on their foreheads, the unmistakable uniform of Field Marshal Rommel's feared Afrika Korps. These weren't liberators or reinforcements. They were Nazi prisoners of war, and they had just quadrupled the town's population overnight. The townspeople who gathered to watch expected monsters, the horned devils their newspapers had warned them about. Instead, they saw something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They saw boys, young, beaten, scared boys, many of them teenagers, covered in the wounds of desert warfare, blinking in the Alabama sun like they couldn't believe where they were. What happened next defies everything we think we know about war. Within months, these enemy soldiers would be picking cotton in Alabama's fields, sharing lunch with local farmers, and forming friendships that would outlast the war itself by decades. But here's what makes this story truly strange. The German prisoners who arrived expecting hell were about to describe their experience as a golden cage, and the Americans who fed them and worked alongside them, some of them couldn't get food stamps during rationing. This is the bizarre, little-known history of how Nazi prisoners of war helped save Alabama's $38 million peanut crop, and how picking cotton alongside the enemy changed everyone involved. To understand how German soldiers ended up farming in Alabama, we need to go back to May 1943 and a place called Tunisia. For 2 years, Rommel's Afrika Korps had fought across the deserts of North Africa. The Desert Fox and his men had become legendary for their tank warfare, their endurance in brutal conditions, and their reputation as formidable fighters. But by early 1943, the tide had turned. Allied forces were closing in from both east and west, squeezing the Axis troops into an ever-shrinking pocket in Tunisia. When the surrender came, it was catastrophic for Germany. 275,000 soldiers, Germans and Italians alike, laid down their weapons. It was one of the largest mass surrenders in military history. Now the Allies had a problem. Britain was already crammed with soldiers, supplies, and refugees from occupied Europe. Housing 250,000 prisoners of war wasn't just impractical, it was impossible. The island was under constant threat of German bombing raids. Food was rationed. Space was precious. So Britain asked its ally across the Atlantic for help. America reluctantly agreed to take the prisoners. It was a decision that would change communities across the country, including one sleepy farming town in western Alabama. The journey to America began in the holds of Liberty ships, the same cargo vessels that had delivered war supplies to North Africa. Now, they were returning home, their holds packed with captured soldiers. For men who had spent months fighting in the scorching desert, the voyage was surreal. Hans Klein, a tank gunner who served under Rommel, later recalled how the French briefly held German prisoners before the Americans took over. "I was told an American major came to our camp by accident, and he saved my life," Klein said. The major found prisoners lying unconscious from starvation and immediately organized ambulances to evacuate the worst cases. The contrast between captors would become a recurring theme. When the transport ships finally approached the American coast, something remarkable happened. The German prisoners were brought up on deck as New York City came into view. Many of them stared in disbelief at the Manhattan skyline, the soaring skyscrapers, the Statue of Liberty standing intact in the harbor. Nazi propaganda had told them that New York had been heavily bombed by the Luftwaffe. They had been assured that American cities lay in ruins. Instead, they were looking at the most impressive urban skyline any of them had ever seen, completely untouched. For many, this was the first crack in the foundation of everything they'd been told about the war. From New York, the prisoners boarded trains bound for camps across the country. The journeys took anywhere from 3 to 5 days. What they experienced on those trains shattered another piece of Nazi propaganda. Many prisoners insisted that the Americans must be driving them in circles to make the country seem larger than it really was. "No country can possibly be this big," they told each other. One German soldier later recalled his shock at the train accommodations. Most of them had always been transported in boxcars during their military service, but the American trains had modern upholstered coaches. When a black porter came through offering a coffee and sandwiches politely, as though we were human beings, the prisoner wrote that most of them forgot the anti-American feelings they had accumulated. By the time the trains reached their destinations, the prisoners were already questioning everything they thought they knew. Back in Alabama, the Army Corps of Engineers had been busy. Construction on Camp Aliceville began in August 1942, before the Afrika Korps had even surrendered. Military planners knew that massive numbers of prisoners would eventually need housing, and they selected sites based on several criteria: distance from major cities and industrial centers, mild climate to reduce construction costs, and proximity to farms that desperately needed labor. Alabama fit perfectly on all counts. The camp was built on land that had been taken from local farmers, including 400 acres of the Parker Farm. Within a few months, the Army had constructed 400 wood-frame barracks capable of holding up to 6,000 prisoners and 900 American personnel. Camp Aliceville would become the largest POW camp in the southeastern United States. 3 other major camps joined it across Alabama: Camp Opelika in Lee County, Fort McClellan in Calhoun County, and Fort Rucker in Dale County. Altogether, Alabama would host approximately 16,000 German prisoners across 24 camps. But the camps weren't built just to warehouse enemy soldiers. They were built to solve a crisis that threatened to devastate Alabama's economy. To understand why Alabama needed enemy prisoners to pick its cotton, you need to understand the Second Great Migration. Beginning around 1940, something historic was happening across the American South. African Americans, who had provided the backbone of agricultural labor since Reconstruction, were leaving, and they were leaving by the millions. In 1910, 90% of Black Americans lived in the South, and 3/4 of them worked on farms. But the combination of Jim Crow oppression, agricultural mechanization, and, crucially, the promise of well-paying factory jobs in northern cities was pulling people away from the cotton fields at an unprecedented rate. During the 1940s alone, 1.5 million African Americans would leave the South for cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New York. Defense factories were offering wages that dwarfed what could be earned picking cotton. For Alabama farmers, this created a nightmare scenario. Cotton and peanuts were the state's most important cash crops. The cotton industry, in particular, relied on massive amounts of hand labor. The mechanical cotton picker wouldn't become widespread until after the war. Every plant needed to be chopped with a hoe under the scorching summer sun. Every boll needed to be picked by hand. Meanwhile, the war was also draining young white men from rural areas. By 1944, approximately 1/3 of Alabama's draft-eligible men were in uniform. The situation was critical. Without labor, crops would rot in the fields. In South Texas, one county agent estimated that, without help, the entire regional cotton crop would have been lost in 1943. Alabama's $38 million peanut crop, essential for producing oil needed for the war effort, hung in the balance. The government tried everything. They brought in workers from Mexico, Jamaica, Barbados, and the Bahamas. They furloughed soldiers from farms so they could return home during harvest. They even created something called the Crop Corps, recruiting city teenagers and women to work in the fields. But it wasn't enough. Then, someone looked at the tens of thousands of prisoners sitting idle in camps across the country and had an idea. The 1929 Geneva Convention had rules about what you could and couldn't do with prisoners of war. Officers couldn't be compelled to work, though they could volunteer. Enlisted men below the rank of sergeant could be ordered to work, but they couldn't be forced into dangerous conditions or work directly related to the war effort, and they had to be paid. The system that evolved was surprisingly complex. Prisoners earned 80 cents per day for work performed outside the camps, roughly equivalent to what American privates received. But they weren't paid in cash that could be used for escape attempts. Instead, they received scrip or coupons that could only be redeemed at camp canteens for luxury items like cigarettes, soda, and ice cream. Farmers who wanted to use POW labor had to go through a formal process. They contacted their county agricultural agent, certified that no other labor was available, and paid the government 45 cents per hour per laborer. At first, only farmers within 25 miles of a main camp could request workers. But as demand grew, the Army established satellite camps, smaller facilities scattered across the agricultural regions, bringing prisoners closer to where they were needed. By 1944, the mobilization of nearly 4,000 POWs saved Alabama's peanut crop. But putting enemy soldiers to work in your fields created tensions that no regulation could fully address. The conditions in the camps were remarkably comfortable, and that was exactly the problem. Under the Geneva Convention, the United States was required to provide prisoners with living quarters comparable to those of its own military. That meant 40 square feet of space per enlisted man. It meant adequate food, medical care, and recreational opportunities. The reasoning was partly humanitarian and partly strategic. American officials hoped that if they treated German prisoners well, Germany would reciprocate with American POWs in their custody. The result was what one German prisoner famously called a golden cage. At Camp Aliceville, prisoners played soccer, formed orchestras led by professional musicians, established camp newspapers, and even created elaborate topiary gardens and flower beds when camp authorities held landscaping contests. They could enroll in college courses, at first through correspondence programs from the University of Michigan and Wisconsin, and later through direct instruction from faculty at the University of Alabama. The food was abundant. Items that had been scarce in wartime Germany, meat, vegetables, sugar, appeared at every meal. Werner Reinsdorff, who was held at Fort Lewis in Washington before being sent to work picking cotton in Arizona, later wrote about a moment that stayed with him for life. It was in August or September 1944 when I stood in front of a shop in the POW camp considering what to buy first, an ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola. The last ice cream I had been able to buy in Germany was years ago, but Coca-Cola? Never before. So I decided to take both. I suddenly realized how extremely lucky I had been to be captured by the American Army, and not the Russian one. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans were living under strict rationing. Sugar was limited, coffee was limited, meat was limited, gasoline was limited. Families were asked to sacrifice constantly for the war effort. Then they opened their newspapers and read stories about German prisoners sunbathing, playing sports, and eating better than many Americans could afford. Headlines like, "Our pampered war prisoners" became common. Charges of coddling erupted in Congress and the press. The resentment was especially bitter for families who had lost loved ones to the same soldiers now lounging in Alabama camps. The man in charge of the POW program, Major General Archer Lurch, was eventually called before Congress to defend the treatment of prisoners. His response has echoed through history. "We love our enemies not because of who they are, but because of who we are." Lurch argued that treating prisoners humanely wasn't weakness. It was a reflection of American values. It was also strategic. Word of good treatment would reach German soldiers still fighting and might encourage them to surrender. Whether this argument satisfied angry Americans is debatable, but the policy held. Yet within the camps themselves, a darker conflict was brewing, one that would prove how complicated the category of enemy really was. According to historian Randy Wall, fewer than 10% of German POWs were devoted Nazis. Most were ordinary conscripts, farmers, factory workers, students who had been swept up in the war like young men in every country. Many had never been true believers. Some had actively opposed the regime, but that 10% created a reign of terror inside the camps. Dr. Stephen Fleck, a camp doctor at Aliceville, described it grimly. "Most of the murders were accomplished with bare hands or some cooking utensil. They cold-bloodedly killed either with knives or strangling during the night. We probably had 2 or 3 such deaths a month. Anybody whom they suspected of wavering in his Nazi enthusiasm. Nobody would squeal, because the squealer would likely meet a similar fate. The committed Nazis harassed, intimidated, and murdered fellow prisoners who they thought had become too comfortable with their American captors or who showed any sign of questioning National Socialism. American camp administrators struggled to address the violence. Eventually, they established segregation camps, where ardent Nazis could be separated from more moderate prisoners. By 1944, Camp Aliceville itself had become one of these segregation camps. Ironically, the same facility where prisoners had created elaborate flower gardens and attended college classes was also housing some of the most ideologically committed Nazis in the American prison system. This internal conflict revealed an uncomfortable truth. The prisoners weren't a monolithic enemy. They were a complex population of individuals, some of whom were just as much victims of Nazi ideology as anyone in the Allied countries. Before we get to what happened when these worlds collided, when Nazi prisoners and Alabama farmers started working side by side in the cotton fields, I want to ask you something. Stories like this don't get told often. They're uncomfortable. They challenge the simple narratives we're taught about heroes and villains. If you think more people should know about this hidden chapter of history, if you believe that understanding the complexity of our past matters, subscribe and hit that notification bell. This channel digs into the stories that textbooks leave out. Now, let's see what happens when you put enemy soldiers to work in a cotton field. The work was brutal. In spring, prisoners chopped weeds from cotton plants with hoes under the scorching Alabama sun. The humidity was oppressive, unlike anything these men from Germany had experienced. Fall meant cotton picking, which was worse. Prisoners dragged heavy canvas sacks between rows of plants, the bags growing heavier with each handful of cotton. The sharp bowls cut their hands until they bled. Everything was picked by hand, no machinery to help. The peanut harvest was different, but equally foreign. One daughter of a German prisoner later shared her father's amazement. He talked to me about Alabama, that earth nuts grow not in the earth. In Germany, we think so. They grow on bushes. The former soldier Heinrich Wolf had never seen peanuts before. He didn't even know they grew underground. One Alabama woman remembered the prisoners who came to work on her family's farm near Fort Rucker. They came to help pick cotton and stack peanuts. We had to furnish meals for them, had to feed them what we had and what we ate. But they did not eat corn on the cob, said it was for swine. That detail captures something important about these encounters. Both sides were constantly running into small cultural collisions. Moments where assumptions about food, work, behavior, and value clashed against an unfamiliar reality. The Germans were baffled by corn on the cob. The Americans were puzzled by the prisoners' insistence on cleanliness. One Georgia woman recalled how German workers would carefully wash their hands up to their elbows before accepting any food. And somewhere in these small negotiations, something unexpected began to happen. Fraternization between prisoners and civilians was officially forbidden. It happened anyway. Working together day after day, sharing meals, communicating through gestures and broken phrases, the farmers and prisoners began to see each other as people rather than categories. The prisoners were, after all, mostly young men from rural backgrounds themselves. Many had been farmers before the war. They understood the rhythm of agricultural work, the satisfaction of a good harvest, the worry about weather and pests. And the Alabama farmers, despite having sons and brothers fighting against Germany overseas, found it difficult to maintain hatred toward the tired, homesick young men picking cotton beside them. Alabamians often formed remarkable relationships with the prisoners working in their midst. According to the Encyclopedia of Alabama, they expressed their friendship through gift-giving and, in a few occasions, invitations to their homes for meals. These weren't supposed to be friendships. The guards were warned against the insidious danger of soft, sticky sentiment or marshmallow friendliness. They were reminded that the good-looking youth, with such charm, was the same murderous maniac who fashioned the booby trap that blew American soldiers into bloody bits. But human nature proved stronger than policy. One guard at Aliceville later reflected that the prisoners were good to him, and they were good to him. After the war, some of the former enemies stayed in contact, exchanging letters across the Atlantic for decades. While the prisoners worked the fields, American officials were conducting a quieter experiment back in the camps. The War Department had established something called the Special Projects Division with an ambitious goal: to re-educate German prisoners in the principles of democracy before sending them back to their devastated homeland. The program included lectures, films, discussion groups, and newspapers written by anti-Nazi prisoners. At Camp Aliceville, a publication called Der Zaungast, The Spectator, gave voice to prisoners processing their experiences. One prisoner, Helmut Thieme, published a poem in the paper that captured the strange melancholy of his situation. When the high Alabama sun sends down its rays, it is never that sun that bestows on us pleasure and love. Historians debate how effective the formal re-education program actually was. Many argue that crash courses in democracy given to adults could never fundamentally change worldviews. But something else was educating these men far more effectively than any classroom. They were seeing America with their own eyes. The abundance in the camp, canteens, the vast agricultural lands that seemed to stretch forever, the black porter on the train who served them coffee with dignity, the farmer's wife who invited them to lunch, despite losing her own son in the war. All of it contradicted what they had been told about America, and for many, that lived experience proved more transformative than any lecture. Then came 1945. As Allied forces penetrated into Germany, they discovered the concentration camps. Suddenly, the Americans running the POW camps faced a new reality. The men they had been treating humanely for 2 years came from a nation that had committed genocide. Werner Reinsdorff, the prisoner who had marveled at ice cream and Coca-Cola, later said that he and other prisoners couldn't believe it when American military officers told them about the atrocities committed in the concentration camps. In the camps, the re-education program shifted dramatically. College courses organized by American universities were suspended. New curricula emphasizing American history, society, and political structure were introduced. But the damage from the discovery of the Holocaust extended beyond education policy. In some camps, conditions grew harsher as American anger over the treatment of their own soldiers in German custody and the revelations about the death camps took hold. The comfortable golden cage was closing. Germany surrendered in May 1945, but the prisoners didn't go home right away. The logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of men back to a devastated continent were overwhelming. Ships were needed. The infrastructure in Germany was destroyed, and many prisoners were transferred to other Allied nations, particularly France and Britain, where they continued to work as laborers, helping rebuild what the war had destroyed. Heinrich Wolf, the former prisoner whose daughter later searched for information about his time in Alabama, was among those transferred. 1945, on the end of the Second World War, USA changed prisoners with France. "Since," she wrote, "my father must go to France," and worked by French farmers till 1949. 4 years after the war ended, some prisoners were still working on foreign farms. Camp Aliceville was deactivated on September 30th, 1945. The other Alabama camps closed around the same time. By 1947, the facilities had been completely dismantled, sold for scrap, torn down, removed. Today, almost nothing remains of Camp Aliceville except a single old stone chimney standing in an empty field. But the memories remained. When the former prisoners finally returned to Germany, they found a country in ruins. Cities had been bombed to rubble. Food was scarce. The economy had collapsed. Families were scattered or dead. And then something remarkable happened. Some of the former prisoners wrote letters back to Alabama, to the farmers who had fed them, to the guards who had watched over them, to the families who had showed them kindness. They asked for dear help, and the Alabamians responded. Across the state, people who had every reason to hate Germany, who had lost sons and brothers and husbands to German bullets, packed boxes of food, clothing, and supplies. They sent them to their former enemies. These acts of generosity continued for years as Germany slowly rebuilt. And then, decades later, the former enemies began to return. Starting in the 1980s, reunions were organized in Aliceville and other former campsites. Former prisoners, now elderly men in their 60s, 70s, 80s, traveled back to Alabama. They walked the grounds where the camps had once stood. They met with the American guards who had watched over them, now equally aged. They visited the families of the farmers who had employed them in the cotton fields. One reunion participant recalled, "Some of those men returned to the U.S. in later years due to their good treatment and the warm weather. They even liked the southern food. I know because I met one of them." The Aliceville Museum, housed in the town's old Coca-Cola bottling plant, became a repository for this history. Former prisoners and their families donated letters, artwork, photographs, and personal items. The museum now holds what is said to be the largest collection of World War II POW memorabilia in the United States. Every year, approximately 3,000 visitors come to the museum, many of them from Germany. About 10% of our visitors every year come from Germany, museum staff reported, and a lot of times when they come, they bring items to donate that belonged to relatives. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of prisoners travel thousands of miles to see where their ancestors spent the war years, to understand the strange chapter of history that shaped their families. In 2016, at the age of 91, Werner Reinsdorff, the former prisoner who had pondered the choice between ice cream and Coca-Cola, returned to America one final time. He rode a bicycle from the Liberty Gate at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington to the site of the former POW camp where he had been held more than 70 years earlier. When he toured one of the surviving buildings, he pointed to a corner and said simply, "My bed was over there." Asked why he had made the journey, Grau said he wanted to thank America for his treatment he never would have received at the hands of other captors. He spoke about the Marshall Plan that helped rebuild Germany after the war. He spoke about the kindness that had changed his understanding of his former enemy. His wife had died 2 years earlier. "She'd have said I was crazy," he admitted, when asked if she would have approved of his pilgrimage. But he had come anyway, because some debts transcend decades and oceans. So what do we make of this story? It's uncomfortable in ways that don't fit neat narratives about World War II. German prisoners were treated better in Alabama than Black American soldiers were treated in their own country. The same restaurants that welcomed Axis POW were segregated against African American servicemen in uniform. Farmers who had sons fighting in Europe showed kindness to the enemy while experiencing rationing at home. Committed Nazis murdered fellow prisoners in the same camps where other Germans created art, music, and poetry. The story resists simple lessons, but perhaps that resistance is itself the point. War creates categories: us and them, friend and enemy, hero and villain. These categories make it possible to fight, to kill, to sacrifice. But in the cotton fields of Alabama, those categories broke down. When you work beside someone day after day, share meals, see their exhaustion, and hear their homesickness, the category of enemy becomes harder to maintain. The German prisoners who came to Alabama expecting hell found something that confused and ultimately changed them. The Americans who were told these men were monsters found something more complicated. Young men like their own sons, caught up in forces larger than themselves. This doesn't excuse the crimes of Nazi Germany. It doesn't minimize the Holocaust or the devastation of the war. But it does remind us that even in the darkest chapters of human history, connection remains possible. And that sometimes picking cotton in the Alabama heat can be as powerful a teacher as any program of re-education. In Aliceville today, almost nothing remains of the camp itself. But in the museum downtown, you can see the paintings the prisoners made, the musical instruments they crafted, the letters they wrote home. You can read accounts from the guards who watched over them and the farmers who worked beside them. You can trace the connections that formed across barbed wire and sustained themselves across decades and oceans. Every year, visitors from Germany come to this small Alabama town to understand what happened to their fathers and grandfathers in this unlikely place. And every year, those visitors leave knowing that history is more complicated, more human, and more hopeful than the textbooks suggest. Because in the end, this isn't really a story about German POW or Alabama cotton or the logistics of wartime labor. It's a story about what happens when enemies become neighbors and discover they were never as different as they thought.